Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by a social psychologist. She is the author of numerous papers in the psychology of power and group behavior, Professor Deborah Gruenfeld. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here, Professor Gruenfeld. So let's start off with you telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Sure. I think the easiest place to start is just to say that I am actually in the family business. So my dad was a university professor, and he taught at Cornell. So I grew up in Ithaca, New York, and I tried, as many teenagers do, to carve my own path in life, but eventually I gave in. And so I'm in my dad's field, actually. And what's really funny about it, he's also a psychologist. Well, he passed away a couple years ago, had a long, happy life, but he's also a social psychologist. And we did not talk a lot about his work when I was growing up, but I had the experience often as an adult of calling him and saying, "Dad, I got this great idea. I want to do a research project on, envy." And he would say, "Oh, I wrote a paper about that in 1970. Mm-hmm. It was just weird. Like, it's almost like there's this weird, mental connection between the two of us in terms of not just our interests, but like the specific things that we find interesting and that we think about in life." So that's the easiest way to describe, I think, how I ended up where I did, or where I have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And right off the bat, what does it mean to be powerful? I suppose it's a very broad question, but for those of us who are not familiar with, the area that you're working on, what do you mean by power?
Yeah, it's a really important question, I think, because it's an abstract idea, and everyone cares about it, but we don't always understand exactly what it is. So, scientifically, we have definitions of power that refer basically to a person's capacity to control others despite their resistance. So that's, scientifically speaking, what power is. And power can come from a lot of different sources. There are many ways in which we develop the capacity to control other people. Sometimes it's by virtue of like a formal role or a title. Sometimes it's because we control access to important rewards and punishments. Sometimes it's because people respect and admire us. So there are a lot of different bases of power, but what power really is by definition is the ability to make other people do things despite their resistance.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to delve more on one of the layers of power, and which is status. And the reason why I invited you to this interview, because I come across one of your lectures, and on one of your lectures, you mentioned that when a person contributes more to a conversation, the more status they acquire, regardless of the quality of the contribution. So if you could just explain to us what's the psychological element behind that.
Sure. So it's one of these really fascinating things about human behavior that most people recognize right away when you say it, which is that if we look at what kinds of behavior are associated with having high status in groups. And I should just say status is slightly different from power in the sense that it refers specifically to the extent to which other people admire and respect us. So status is an important source of power, but it's a slightly different thing. The interesting finding that you're referring to is that it's the quantity of verbal contributions that are associated with status controlling for quality. So it's not that quality doesn't matter at all, but speaking more tends to be associated with having higher status. That's the finding that you're referring to. So that's challenging for people who are introverted and people who don't like to fight for airtime in a group situation. And a lot of us relate to that, I think. But yeah, as a general rule, talking more and also interrupting others more tends to be associated with achieving like higher status and influence in groups, even though it doesn't always feel good to be in a room with a person like that. We tend to give them the right to do that even more once they've done it.
And presumably it would also translate the same to your online behavior. Say, for instance, the more you tweet, the more you actively engage on Facebook or YouTube, would that also confer you the same kind of status as in the physical world?
You know, it's so interesting. I mean, yes, absolutely. So a big part of it really is attention. You know, so one of the other things we know in the research on power and status is that attention follows power, and the more people attract attention, the more attention we give to others, the more standing they have, even when the things that they're doing to attract attention are not all that attractive. So I think that that's super interesting. But yes, I think that more tweeting and more posting is probably associated with more status. Something else that I'll mention just because it occurred to me and I think it's fascinating. I don't really know if there's research to back this up or not, but you know, I have teenagers at home and I pay attention to what goes on in their online world. You can learn a lot about status and power by looking at how teenagers respond to one another. One of the things that I noticed is that in their online behavior, and this is especially true for girls because that's what I have, I think more, you know, like tweeting more, also commenting more on other people's tweets, and very, very positive, friendly, loving, supportive tweets are, I think, what really earn people's status. And I think that that's not intuitive. You know, we tend to think of these high-powered people who are throwing their weight around as you know, dismissive and putting other people down. But I have noticed in these, you know, more social contexts that people earn a lot of power and status by making others feel special and valued, and by, you know, paying attention to other people. So I think that's a useful thing for, you know, professional adults to know, that there is a lot of power actually in making others feel special. So it's not always the negative, you know, the negative spin on power that explains everything.
Now, earlier you already alluded to this. It's not really the quantity of your conversation or interruption that really is the predictor of status. So what would you say is the greatest predictor of status? Would you say it's gender? Presumably you've also done a bit of research on gender, or is it wealth? What is it then?
Yeah, you know, so all of these things obviously play a role. I think if we, you know, just to start at the simplest level, which is to say, you know, take a small group of peers and control for some of these other factors, which I'm happy to talk to you about separately, you know, things like gender, things like socioeconomic status, race, all of these things make a difference. The things that we know predict status most powerfully are dominance is the first one. So dominance is an actual physical way of behaving, and you know, taking more speaking turns is part of it, but it also has to do with more generally how much space you take up in the group physically as well. So people who are physically intimidating, people who are large, they don't even have to be physically large, but people who use their body in a way to claim a lot of space and territory, who violate other social boundaries, who, you know, use furniture wrong by, you know, using two chairs, you know, you're sitting in one, you've got your arm around another, or putting your feet on someone's desk. I mean, all of these things that are associated with taking up physical space, being intimidating, and just having a large footprint, all of those things are very predictive of status. So that's one thing. The other quality that's predictive of status is a kind of a different, more related to to respect than fear, I would say, is something called prestige, which really has to do with sharing knowledge and expertise, being perceived as highly competent, and doing it in a way that is responsive to what others need, as opposed to trying to just always win every argument. So there are those kind of two, I mean, in my field, we talk about this as like two paths to the top. One is this like kind of intimidation, the dominance path, which predicts status very reliably. And the other one is what's called prestige, and it really has to do with more relying on your competence as an expert, as opposed to the physical dominance. So those are the two paths that are dominated most, or that are most reliably demonstrated in the research. And to your other question, I mean, obviously, gender is associated with physical dominance. I just think that in general, this doesn't apply to everyone, but in general, men are raised to use their bodies in more dominant ways. I think society expects men to behave that way, and when men don't behave that way, it makes them feel, I think, especially vulnerable. So men tend to naturally, I think, exhibit more dominance, and this is part of what contributes to their having more influence. But the other interesting thing about gender is that we have these kind of role expectations that we associate with people from different genders. We because of what we've experienced and learned in our lives, where men tend to have more power and status than women across most parts of the world, we naturally look to men for leadership, and we naturally look to women for nurturing and caretaking. And those expectations have self-fulfilling aspects too. So yeah, absolutely. Men tend to attain status and power more readily than women. But interestingly, women are often perceived as more effective in leadership roles when they attain them. So there are different advantages associated with both genders.
I suppose it's because women are more thorough with their communication style. I'm speaking in general terms, whereas men are more authoritative and they've got more commanding aura when they speak. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, in some, for sure, in some ways that's absolutely true, but I think it goes even a little deeper than that. So, what people have argued is that, that women just are naturally raised to put other people's interests first. It's just part of being socialized as a woman. And so they tend to defer naturally and to naturally try to support and elevate others, where men are trained to not show weakness and to claim, the upper hand in every situation. So yeah, I think all of those things are right, and you do see it in speaking styles in the way that you just described.
And of course, Professor Gruenfeld, another aspect of your work is body language. So if you could tell us how we can use body language to create an impact.
Absolutely. So, I'm trying to think of a way to kind of boil this down for you. So one of the things that I just described before that is very useful for people to know is the impact of physical dominance and the idea of being comfortable using your body to take up space. I think it's not natural for everyone. A lot of us, especially in situations where we worry about how we're being evaluated or we worry about offending people, will naturally, as almost like a politeness thing, take up a little bit less space than we need. It's a way of showing deference. But one of the things I work with leaders on a lot, especially new leaders, so I do a lot of work with young company founders, for example, who are kind of transitioning into a role where they need to show up more powerful, is learning how to make sure their body stays open. So having, there are nonverbal things that are related to in-person interactions, and then there's the nonverbal things, how they apply to what we're dealing with now, I think is an interesting subject as well. So but keeping your body open. I think having an open chest is very important. So even, you and I can see one another now, but if I'm sitting with my shoulders back, it creates a very different feeling than if I'm sitting this way with my shoulders folded in, So anything that we do to make ourselves smaller, to protect ourselves physically, even crossing our legs, keeping our knees together, all of these things take away from our power. So practicing being open, practicing using our hands in an authoritative way. Also, the way we use our heads is very interesting. So when a very authoritative way of speaking is to speak with your head perfectly still, which also feels very unnatural when you do it, but there's something very serious about it when you hold your head perfectly still, where a more naturally deferential way of behaving would be to tilt your head to the side while you're speaking, or to nod while you're speaking. Any of the things that I do with my head or my body that show a little bit of energy leaking out take away from the power of my energy being channeled directly at you in a kind of more authoritative or intimidating way. So those are some of the ways to project power physically. I think paying attention to your speech is also something that people can learn to adjust. So one of the interesting things about speaking, we were talking earlier about projecting power by talking more. It's a little more subtle than that. So it's powerful to take many speaking turns, but it's not powerful to cram as many words as possible into the shortest time, which a lot of us do. Like if we're anxious, if we're a little bit worried that maybe what we're saying isn't worth the time we're taking, we'll speak very quickly. So I often will help people learn to slow down and to use pauses as a way of conveying authority, and also articulating consonants, interestingly, is more authoritative. So it's a more deferential way to speak to use long vowels, and a more powerful or authoritative way to speak is to articulate every consonant.
I'm actually learning from you now, so the next time I have my guests, I will actually remember those points that you've told us.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to laugh because you can imagine whenever I have these conversations with people, everyone gets very self-conscious. So you see, you're now fixing yourself, and I feel it too. Me talking about these things and seeing myself on the screen, it's very hard not to think like, oh, am I doing that right now? So I think the very first stage is just awareness, and you can become very self-conscious, but then making little adjustments, eventually it's like riding a bicycle. Eventually it kind of becomes second nature. But yeah, you're doing great. You're doing great.
Thank you. This actually brings me to my next point. You introduced a framework known as acting with power. So talk through us about it. And what I mean by that is, I suppose I'm looking for the application. I suppose this is for, like, if you're working in an organization or you're working to improve your self-confidence, but what other real-world application do we have for, knowing about mastering a body language, or knowing about status and power? What's other application we have beyond the obvious, I suppose?
I mean, I think, one of the most important things that I've tried to emphasize in acting with power as like an approach to thinking about power, which, is really like, I think the most natural way to think about power as a topic is to focus on like how to get more power. And I think that's interesting. What I've tried to focus on is more, learning how to be conscious and mindful about using the power that you already have. And the reason that I take this approach, and I think it's applicable to a lot of people in a lot of situations, is that most of us are not aware of our own power. So most of us feel powerless. We feel insecure. We're aware of all the ways in which maybe we are afraid we don't live up to other people's expectations, or we get promoted into a new role, we're suddenly the boss, and we wonder whether people will be able to see through us, like the emperor with no clothes, like, oh, you're acting like a boss now, but really you're just like a little kid, wearing your dad's suit or whatever. Everybody feels powerless. But because we occupy roles, because we, are all older siblings or parents or managers or team leaders or even just the expert in the room sometimes, we have power. We have a natural capacity to control others, and we can't feel it. Only they can feel it. So what I think is really important for all of us in thinking about how to, be effective in our roles at work is to be able to take the perspective of others and to understand that even when we feel worried about taking up too much space, worried about speaking with expertise, worried about acting very authoritative, taking charge of a meeting, interrupting people, trying to get quieter people to talk, all of these controlling actions. The people around us hope we will do these things because we're the person with responsibility for controlling what happens around us, even if we can't feel ownership of that authority. And I think this is one of the most important things, is for people to understand that using the power you have to create an environment where others feel more secure is a very generous thing to do. So we shouldn't be afraid of asserting our power or owning our authority or claiming space when, because of our role, this is what other people need from us. So I think that's one of the biggest takeaways. And I think the other thing I guess I would say is that, as much as it's important to, be in charge, be authoritative, and use power effectively in those ways, it's very important for the people around us to be able to trust that we have their interests at heart, that we're not just using power to protect ourselves or to elevate ourselves or, improve our own positions and our own advantage. So I think it's very important, especially when you have, power and authority by virtue of a role that you play in an organization or in your family, is to be able to show that you really care about other people's interests. Because when we're in charge, people don't give us the benefit of the doubt on that. And I often tell people, it's not a question of whether you care about your subordinates and their interests. Of course you care. Every manager cares. But we don't always show that we care, and this is where the acting piece comes in. It's like whenever we feel anxious or worried, I think a lot of people at work right now are very concerned with all the challenges they're facing because of, the economic consequences of what we're dealing with, and the fact that everyone's working from home and people are being laid off. I mean, there are so many tremendous business challenges that people are dealing with. When we have anxiety and when we're worried about solving problems, we come across often as distant and aloof. And it's just because we're in our heads. We may be thinking about how to save the company. We may be thinking about how to protect our employees from some pending disaster. But without having the skills to come out of our heads and to really connect with people and look them straight in the eye and say, I really want to know what's going on with you. I actually really care about what's happening to you. I'm here with you today. I will be here with you tomorrow. People won't trust that we're capable of using our rights and privileges to take care of them. And that's really important for being effective in positions of power. If people don't trust us, we don't have the influence we want to have. So those are two things, right? It's giving yourself permission to use your authority to create a secure place for others. It's very generous, but that also remembering that you may have to work a little bit extra to remind people that you care by acting like you care, showing up more often than normal, for example, and really connecting with people so that they can feel that they trust your intentions as well.
Mhm. And I think one of the evidence that you actually care is your approachability. And based from what you said, I think you have to balance that. You have the authority, you have the status, you have the power. At the same time, you remain approachable to your, shall we say, subordinates, for lack of better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
Especially
absolutely.
like you
And
said.
I tell people often, it's easy to lose sight of when you're in a position of power and you're worried about appearing weak. I think this is what people worry about a lot in positions of power. It's easy to lose track of the fact that when you are the high status person or the high power person, others want to feel close to you. And if you can't reveal your own vulnerability sometimes, if you can't ask for help, they don't have any way in, And so we want people to respect us in positions of authority, but we also need them in our corner
Mhm.
for when we're in trouble. And so this ability to come down off the pedestal at the right time and reveal that we're vulnerable and ask people for help is also, to be approachable is very, very important in these positions as well. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Mhm. And of course, Professor Gruenfeld, you also wrote a book about this. So if you could just tell us what your book is about, and also if you've got favorite part of the book.
Sure. So, I wrote this book, Acting with Power, for a couple different reasons. One of them was that I wanted to make the idea of having power and wielding power more attractive to a broader range of people. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, there's this kind of fictional dichotomy in the world where we tend to think people who care about power are selfish
Mm-hmm.
and self-interested and, maybe even evil.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of us who can't identify with it and don't want to be that person will say, you know what, I'm going to leave the power, fighting for power. I'm going to leave this to like the bad guys over there because I'm a good person. And I think that it's all based on this misconception that power is evil by definition. I mean, it's not. The power, the purpose of power, actually, if you look at it in the context of human groups, in the context of animal groups, in families, in organizations, the reason that we give some people, extra rights and privileges is because we hope that they will protect the rest of us from challenges and shocks and threats to the group and to the system. And so power is a resource that exists for the protection of other people. And this is something I think a lot of us can identify with. That is the person a lot of us want to be, and especially for people who don't identify as leaders or as someone who cares about power, it's important to realize that power can be used for good
Mm-hmm.
just as much as it can be used for bad. But I wanted to try to draw people from, different parts of society, people who feel at the margins, people who feel like they're not part of, not in the room where it happens, not, second-class citizens, that the idea of having power and being an advocate and protecting other people and doing whatever it takes to advance causes and protect people who are more vulnerable than we are is something that a lot of us can relate to. So I really just wanted to make the idea of having power more appealing to a broader range of people. And so to do that, I think what I've tried to do is first, in the book, reframe power as, not so much a resource for personal self-aggrandizement, but a resource for helping others. And then to provide guidance about how to use power effectively for maximal impact with that pro-social goal in mind, So a lot of it has to do with, what you raised already, which is like knowing what kinds of contexts to approach more authoritatively. Like, when should you try to throw your weight around? When should you speak as though you're the expert in the room and, speak in a way to end a conversation versus, showing up with a very different approach of trying to empower others and be more approachable and push some of the power down in the organization. So I've tried to argue that, to be effective with power, everybody needs both of these skills, both of these skill sets, both the authoritative side and the more approachable side. And most of us are specialists in one, and we're, like novices on the other one. So I try to give advice to everyone. For people who need to learn how to be more authoritative, there are a lot of tips for how to use your body language and how to change your mindset so that you can go into a situation feeling like your strongest, most fearless self. And then for people who need to learn how to be less intimidating, and how to connect better with others, again, what are the ways that you can use your body to make yourself more approachable, and what are the ways you can change your mindset so that people see you as an advocate and as someone to trust as opposed to someone to be afraid of.
And presumably there's also a role that the personality style would play in this.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
If you're an introvert, it's a lot easier for you to be more approachable, whereas if you're an extrovert, people would easily perceive you as someone who's more in charge.
I think that that's true in some ways, but one of the interesting things I've noticed about introverts especially is that because many introverts feel vulnerable and worried about taking up too much space. But it doesn't always translate to being more approachable because, like I was saying earlier, one of the challenges introverts have, and I think I fall into this category sometimes, is that we spend a lot of time in our heads. And so when introverts feel friendly, they don't always appear friendly because they have that thing of like being in their head. I've worked with a lot of people who are very cerebral, who are, who live a lot in their minds. And so for introverts, part of it is being more authoritative, but part of it is just getting more comfortable, stepping out of your comfort zone and connecting with people, to show that you have friendly feelings, because it's not always written all over our faces, And some of the people that I've taught have said to me that the most useful thing they took away from the idea of acting with power was just knowing that you can learn to, act, you can learn to behave in new ways, to deal with challenges like being more introverted, to act more extroverted, even though you're an introvert, in a way that can become very authentic. It's just a question of practice and trusting that if you have the right motives, it will come across true.
And you're shedding some lights on power and status, but obviously since you've been working for decades in this area, you've come across some of the myths about body language, about power and status. So could you share to us some of those myths that you've come across?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, a really important one is that if you look at the way most people think and talk about power, they start from a place of deficit and thinking, I don't have enough power. I feel like I'm not respected enough. I feel like I'm not authoritative enough. I'm not sure I can really control people effectively. And so I have to get more power. I have to figure out how to build my personal power and build my sources of competitive advantage. And I think that in reality, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, most of us have more power than we think we do already. And that really changes the calculus. Then the challenge is, if you want to be maximally effective, if you want to be successful, if you want to be admired and thought of as someone who is a leader in your organization, it's not a question of trying to cover for weakness. It's a question of embracing the power that you have and getting comfortable using it. It's a really completely different approach. So that, I think, is a really important myth. Most of us are more powerful than we think we are already. And we need to own that. I mean, there is a lot of risk associated with being the boss who doesn't realize that, his subordinates can't say no.
Mhm.
This is how we run into all these issues with sexual harassment and misconduct and, claims of inappropriate, taking exploiting people who work for us sexually, right? So it's often, I think often men with power aren't fully aware of the impact that they have on other people because of their power, right? So part of it is like we have to kind of own all that and say, yeah, I may not feel like a rock star, but that's who I am to these people, you know what I mean? So you kind of have to own and embrace it as a way of learning to act responsibly with power, which I think is a really important part of the story too, and something I talk a lot about in the book. So that's one of the big ones, I think. Another one is this idea that, that you have to be the most aggressive person in the room to be influential and have status. And we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's definitely one of the ways to do it, but it's not the only way. And it may not be the most effective way in the long term. So there are studies coming out now that show sometimes people who are more low key, who use that more prestige-based style I talked about earlier, people who are more quiet in the meeting, more low key, they offer their expertise and insight like on an as needed basis as opposed to trying to control the room. Sometimes takes those people longer to achieve a position of power and status. But over time, theirs tends to grow. They exceed others' expectations of them, where what happens sometimes to the very dominant person is they end up not living up to other people's expectations of them. So, it's not just that you have to be a jerk, that you have to throw your weight around, that you have to be more competitive and more aggressive to be powerful. It's one way to do it, but it's not the only way, and it's not even necessarily the best way in the long run.
I want to add more to that myth. I'm sure you've heard about, the power posture, and there's a famous study about that if you engage in power posturing, it affects your confidence. Would you say that's a myth, or does that
a great
really
question.
help boosting self-confidence?
That's a great question. I think that there's a lot of evidence, both in the science and, just in my experience working with, professional actors and directors in the classroom and taking acting classes myself as a way of learning more about, the impact of nonverbal behavior. So I think the research is pretty much supportive of the idea that using your body in an expansive way can make you feel more powerful. I think the part that's less clear in the science, I don't know if I would call it a myth. I guess what I would say is the jury's still out. What's a little bit less clear is why. And I think, one of the reasons this has become, kind of, I wouldn't say a controversial topic, but one where people have said, oh, power posing is the next great thing. And the people were like, well, maybe the science doesn't support it. I think it's just that, the original studies showed that there was this strong hormone change in hormones that happens when you use your body in an expansive way, and that causes the psychological changes. I don't think we know yet whether that's true or not. But I think the evidence that using your body in an expansive way changes how you feel is that there is a lot of evidence. And I would say, for me, one of the most important parts of that is that, when you show nonverbal dominance in a social context where other people are, and those people want to establish a good relationship with you, they want to have rapport, they will naturally behave more submissively. So this is a really interesting finding from research, which is that if you put strangers together who are motivated to get along, and one of them starts out either in a power pose, dominant, physically dominant, or submissive, physically submissive, the other person will subconsciously non-verbally do the opposite. So it's almost like a natural seesaw, and it's, just reveals to us that we kind of like hierarchical relationships, even though we don't think we do. Like, something about knowing who's in charge makes everyone relax. It's like, okay, he's going to ask the questions today. Thank God I don't have to worry about this, right? That's your job. You'll ask the questions, you'll watch the time, you'll deal with the pacing. I'll just answer the questions. So when we come to agreements about these things, everybody can relax and just do their job. So part of what this means, getting back to your point, is that in the real world, when we use nonverbal dominance, other people who want to get along with us are naturally more submissive. And that's part of what makes us feel powerful. Do you know what I mean? It's not so much the direct effect of what we did, but it's seeing other people give us a lot of their visual attention and act a little bit, intimidated or impressed or very interested in us. Those are the things I think that really, it's how others feel about us that affects our own sense. It's that feedback that I think is really the most powerful. So yeah, there's no reason not to use power poses. I don't think it hurts.
Yeah.
But I think, really, from my point of view, and again, we don't really know yet on the science, I really think that the social feedback aspect of it is very important. So think about it this way, if you go into a meeting with your boss and you act very dominant, and they tell you to cut it out by being even more dominant, you're not going to feel powerful afterwards, right? It's like, it's their reaction to you is going to make you feel small, even if you were trying to be big. So very important to think about context in these situations. Like, the things that work in some situations are just not advisable. In others, people often ask me in my classes, I teach MBA students, and we start talking about these things in the beginning of the class, and people will often jump to the conclusion, oh, if I have a job interview in 45 minutes, if I go into the room and put my feet on the desk, will that make me more impressive? It's like, slow down, like, let's think about this for a minute, right? Because people lose track of the fact that a very important source of status and power in relationships is making others feel powerful. Showing others respect, elevating others, showing that we're not coming for them, that we don't intend to try to knock them off their position. This is a really critical social skill for anyone. And it's part of the reason why we need to have that whole, not just the playing your power upside, but knowing how to play it down and be deferential and show others respect is equally important.
And I think it's really important that you really contextualize some power posturing, just like what you said. Personally, I would prefer someone like, if you're talking, let's say for a TED talk or you're giving a lecture, it's really important that you do power poses, because it adds to the drama, shall we say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, it's an interesting thing that I've noticed too, working with theater people and paying attention to, like, when you're watching someone and thinking about the impact they're having on you, when, like, a TED Talk is a great example. So in a TED Talk, you're playing the role of an expert on the stage, and you'll be aware of all the things you don't know. And you'll be aware of, it might feel a little weird to be giving a TED Talk. Like, am I really an expert enough to give a TED Talk? But the thing is, in the audience, everyone is like, please act like the expert now. You know what I mean? And if the person on the stage or running the meeting shows uncertainty about the role they're playing, it makes the audience anxious for them. Do you know what I mean? And that gets in the way of the whole thing. It's like, really, what everybody wants to happen is, like, the expert just own the stage, act like the expert, show that you're confident, and then we can relax and act like audience members, and not have to feel worried about whether you're going to be okay. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that the power posing is, before going on stage, it's great. I mean, I also, I write a lot about this in the book. There's a lot of interesting things we can do, just, you know, forgetting about the body language for a minute, like before going into a TED Talk, before going into a high stakes situation, just to pay attention to what we're thinking about. So to try to make sure that that the things that are going through our head are going to be helpful to us. So an example would be like, I don't really do power posing before going into high stakes situations, but I often do take a moment to make sure that my imagination is working for me. So if I'm anticipating going onto a stage or having this interview with you, or, you know, I just did a webinar with like 600 people who I couldn't see, you know, so your imagination is going to run away and like, how is this going to go? And it's very common to worry, you know, like, what if I can't answer that question? You know, what if he doesn't like the answer to my question? What if I talk too much? What if I, you know, what if I go blank? Like, these are all things. What if someone doesn't like me? These are all things that we naturally worry about. And it ends up putting you in a situation where you go on to the stage fearful. And that comes across aloof. It doesn't come across fearful. It comes across a little bit hostile. So the thing that I've tried to do is to just turn my attention to like, what's the best possible outcome from this situation? What's my dream about how this is going to go? You know, like, what are all the cool things I'm going to learn about you during this conversation? And what are the things we're going to laugh about together? And, you know, whose mind, you know, how cool will it be if someone in the audience has an aha moment when I'm talking? Like, I just try to put my attention on all the things that could go right. And it completely changes my, you know, my sense of what I'm capable of. And I think the most important thing is it gives you the opportunity to just focus on the content, focus on the audience, focus on, you know, living up to their expectations in the best possible way. It just makes everything, when I do it, it makes me feel more generous as opposed to afraid, you know? So it's another way to approach those situations is just to, you know, put your imagination on a leash. You know what I mean? It's like, don't let it take you down those dark, you know, down those dark rat holes. You know, don't think about the person who always disagrees with you before you go into the meeting, or the person who you think doesn't respect you. Think about the person who you know loves you, the person who's always smiling and nodding and told you did a great job last time. If you have to fill your head with something, it's like, think of the smiley face in the room, not the frowny face, you know? And there are a lot of things we can't control in such high stakes situations, but one of the things we can control is where our attention goes. So I always try to be very mindful of that.
That's important points to remember. If, you know, as soon as this lockdown is over, when we go back to our respective workplaces, we've learned something from Professor Gruenfeld. Now, I just want to go back to your background. So
Sure.
I'm always interested how people like yourself come up with this status and background. So I was just wondering, is there a particular individual or piece of work which is the greatest influence in your work? Earlier you told me that you've got an academic background. So would that be a particular person?
I mean, so putting my dad aside, which is, the older I get, the harder it is for me to not see just the huge impact that he had on me. You know what, I guess I would say, what can I say about that? I think one of the most influential scholars for me was someone named David McClelland, who was a professor at Harvard, who studied motivation and looked at how, from a personality standpoint, like how throughout childhood we develop different patterns of motives, why some of us care more about power than others, and why some of us care more about achievement than others. And he looked at how those motives really affect the trajectory of people in their professional lives, and talked a lot about, what kinds of childhood experiences might be associated with using power responsibly as an adult versus irresponsibly as an adult. And one of his students is David Winter. He's another psychologist who's continued that line of work and studied, the personalities of US presidents as one example, and tried to distinguish those whose, careers had scandals in them from those who didn't. So I think on the scholar side, in terms of power, those two really had a big impact on me. And I think the other person I really need to acknowledge is my grad school advisor, whose name is Joe McGrath. I didn't know as much about him, I think, going into things, but he was really interested in groups, and he was someone who was really like a role model for me in terms of how responsible he was with his power, how, he was a favorite mentor for a lot of women in my PhD program. He grew up with a lot of older sisters, and I think naturally saw women as sources of status and power where, at that time, I'm not sure everybody felt that way. And I think a lot of us really felt so respected and so supported by him. So, the ideas are important. And then obviously for everyone, I try to remind people, when you're looking for examples of when you're developing your own approach to power and status and trying to, develop an approach and a philosophy, it's important to think about, like, who are the people in your life who made you feel most secure, who made you feel most confident and most capable, and then to try to look at how they used the power they had in your life and try to learn from that.
I'll put those names that you mentioned on the description box, so the listeners and the viewers can actually learn more about those people that you've mentioned.
Super.
Now, Professor Gruenfeld, what's the most important thing you want the public to learn about your work?
I think the most important thing is that I want people to get the idea that power is not just a resource that's meant to enhance individuals, and it's not just a resource or source of corruption. That it's power is actually a relationship. It's not just a resource, it's a relationship. You can't have power without people who have less power than you, who need you for things. And what that means is that power comes with responsibilities. And I think we see too much in the world of people not understanding that, not seeing power as an obligation, as a duty, as a source of responsibility to other people. So I think that's the most important thing. I would like people, when they think of power, to see it more as a source of good in society and something that they should use for that purpose.
You know what? It may sound cheesy, but when you mention that, one thing that comes to my mind is I'm an immigrant here in Britain, and the one thing that really comes to mind is the monarchy. Like they're not really elected, and they could be ousted anytime. Their position would be irrelevant soon. I don't know when, but somehow people still attribute power and status to them, and it's supposed because they don't really force it upon us. They're just there when we need, reminder, inspiration. I think that's a more fitting example for those listening in.
I love it. I'm so glad you brought it up, because people think I'm crazy when I talk about the monarchy, but there's so many great things. So here's one of my favorite things about it. I think you're 100% right. I think this is how the monarchy thinks of their power and status. I mean, at least the current monarchy, from the way it looks to me, I think this is how they think about it. And so it's like they're there to be a source of security and a source of support.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I think we can all take away from this is that, so if you try to imagine in your high power position that you are the queen or the king to someone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you are someone's king or queen, right? If other people depend on you, that's who you are. A really interesting thing, so try to imagine what that's like. A really interesting thing about the queen is that actually the queen can't really fail. I mean, she actually can't, no matter what she does, she's the queen.
Mm-hmm.
And if we thought about ourselves that way, if we were less fearful of losing our own power and status, I think we would all be more generous. You know what I mean? It's like if there's no chance of appearing incompetent, of screwing up somehow, of appearing like, like that they're actually going to see the person behind the role. If we didn't worry about those things, I think we could all be more caring of others and more generous. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's fascinating. And I've spent a lot of time thinking, for people who are interested in this, I've spent a lot of time thinking about coronation ceremonies and how in business we don't have this, like somebody gets promoted and gets a big position, they become the CEO. Nobody puts a crown on their head or gives them a staff and then reminds them of their responsibilities. Do you know what I mean? Like if you look at what happens in a coronation ceremony, it's this process of reminding the queen and the public of what she promises to do
Mm-hmm.
with the power that she has. And it creates a system that everybody can kind of get behind, I think, where, when we don't do this in real life, we're always trying to figure out on the fly, and we're not sure what we've committed to, and the public's not sure what we've committed to, and so then they don't trust us and they don't know what our motivations are. So roles are important. Roles are important, very important, yeah.
And reminding, I suppose, reminding us of the significance of their roles, and how you should actually value those roles. Now, for something less serious, I always ask this on my guests. So, what's your distressing outlet? What other interests do you have other than psychology?
So I love art of all kinds. I actually like to watch, I like to do art, but I wouldn't describe myself as an accomplished artist. It's more like I just appreciate art. Like I actually collect paintings on Pinterest just so that I have my own gallery. Like, I can just go and look at them. Something about the beauty is just like, it just fills me up. I love to watch dance. I love to watch individuals interpreting the music through their bodies. Like, I find that super inspiring. I love listening to music. I love theater. I love reading plays and just thinking about the playwright and what they meant to convey and the words that they chose. So yeah, I think art is the big one for me.
Brilliant. And finally, what's in the pipeline? You just had your Zoom meeting to 600 or so audience.
Yeah.
Do you have any upcoming webinars? Because I might upload this tonight.
Oh, that's a great question. I have one coming up with the How To Academy. That's coming up soon. I'm not going to be able to remember the date, but I think anybody who's interested can find that on Twitter. People have been tweeting about that. So that one's coming up soon. And what else do I have coming up? There are some things that I had booked in person that I still don't know if they're happening at all. So I can't talk about those. I don't know, but definitely have that one coming up on the relatively in the relatively near future.
Well, it's been an insightful conversation with you, Professor Grunfeld, but unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise, and I look forward to hearing more about your work.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for your interest.